now I'm quite happy to announce the next lecturer. This will be Ruhi Tyson. He is from Sweden, Stockholm, and has origin in the US. And he is a bookbinding teacher and is very much related to crafts. And furthermore, he did his doctorate in 2017 at Stockholm University with the title Vocational Bildung. So he used the German word Bildung, where there is no good translation to be found. And so he combines really something which is not so often connected. He's deeply grounded in the craft work and is deeply grounded in the pedagogical work of Waldorf education. And at the same time, he did his dissertation in that field and connects this reflective research methodology to the Waldorf education practice. And in this field, he is still working. He's on the one hand lecturer at Stockholm University, and he is in the teacher training center of the Waldorf University College in Stockholm. And yeah, we are looking forward to your lecture, Rui, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Jost. And it's a tall task to be invited to say something about areas of development for Waldorf education and actually presume to have a lot to say. I'm sitting here in front of, I could count 79 people with, I assume, at least an average 10 or 20 years of experience in teaching. So that makes a lot of years. And I will try to give a brief overview of this topic. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. As you said, my dissertation was on the topic of vocational Bildung, and so I will make all of us English-speaking people a bit unhappy by insisting on using this German and from my point of view, Swedish term as well, because it has a very educational slant, which, while still connecting to a lot of things that I think are valuable as a kind of background to what goes on in Waldorf education. And I think I've purposely chosen to talk here about material Bildung rather than, for instance, practical or vocational, because there's also something that I'd like to emphasize that I think is one of the most almost unique elements in Waldorf schools. There are a lot of things we do that are things that other people do as well from various perspectives. We're not the only ones who have epochs as lessons. They do that in different ways in other reform educational institutions as well. There's emphasis on arts in particular and on crafts as well to some degree in other schools, even if it's perhaps unusual. But this emphasis on the materials, how we design things, what materials we introduce to our students, I think is unusually thought through. But still, as I write here, in its infancy, in the sense that what it could be, what potential it holds. And that's what I'm going to spend the next hours or so to speak of. But I would like to begin because I think it's important, especially for us who work in educational science, to be clear that pedagogy as a science isn't really a descriptive science. It's not like a lot of psychology where you just describe what actually happens, but pedagogy, I would say, is always about how we can, with the greatest effort of our imagination, think about how things could be if they were as enriching as possible. Or as I tried to say here, to welcome the most enriching world into our midst that we can think of. So it's easy to lose track of that sometimes because that also says a lot about what science is in educational contexts. Uh, and to start things off, of course, I have to say something about the concept of Bildung for those of us who aren't already familiar with it, and also some perhaps to those of us who are so familiar with it that it has become simply a synonym of education or kind of catch-all concept that doesn't really mean anything specific, which it can be, especially in Swedish, I know, and I think in German as well. And so I think from one point of view, you can talk about categories of Bildung in the sense of educational affordances. I'm proposing here that we talk about material Bildung, and that's what I'm not going to actually say much about it yet, but I will be speaking about it extensively hereafter. But I also would like to emphasize that we can talk about Bildung as a process in the sense that we can basically just ask each other what experiences have appeared in our lives that were unusually rich and meaningful. This, if you listen to Professor Jost's presentation a month ago or so, connects very clearly to the kind of new spirituality that I think you were speaking of there. And is one of the reasons why I think it's so valuable to use the concept of Bildung as a way of explaining what we're striving for in a Waldorf educational context. So I think it's valuable to consider Bildung that way for two reasons. One has been from a research reason. It's very easy then to just ask people, talk about something that was very meaningful to you, where you felt unusually enriched by, in an educational setting, of course, teaching or interaction with students, or when you were a student yourself, and so on. And you will get these narratives of Bildung processes. Uh, but I would say, in fact, our core documentations, at least oftentimes, of the vocational knowledge of teachers. So I'm going to end up telling you a bunch of stories really shortly. And all of these stories are not really meant just to be nice illustrations, but are meant to exemplify how we can transmit or document or codify the kind of knowledge that is, I think, especially important for us in the development of education, and not least then in Waldorf education. Um, and I think I wanted, after having just on my way over here to the studio where I'm sitting, listen to Jos' presentation on spirituality, also say something about Bildung and participation, because I think that even more clearly connects to this issue. The picture you're seeing is one of the most impressive works of art I've been a participant of in the last 20 or so years. It's by Wolfgang Leib. Uh, it's a wax corridor or a room. It's basically a huge, not a huge, a small, a corridor coated entirely by thick wax tablets of beeswax. So you're almost walking into a beehive. And the kind of experience you get from that overwhelming warmth and scent of honey, and so is almost indescribable, and in one way summarizes a lot of what material Bildung has to offer. And of course, I see no reason why not every Waldorf school would have an entrance to its main hall where you would walk through a wax-coated corridor, so that every time you go into the school, this envelopment of warmth is actually part of your sensory experience. And I think that has a lot to do with what you were talking about towards the end of the lecture, Justin, that what we do when we work this extensively with arts and crafts is that we work with a kind of spirituality that has an unusual richness in the way it speaks to both our senses and our intellect. And I think uh, Owen Barfield, who was a British anthroposophist, who in many ways transformed a lot of what Steiner talked about in regards to the human evolution of consciousness, would phrase this, I would say, in talking about something he called original participation, where you are, if you go really far back in time, basically one with your environment, with the human collective, and with the world in general. And he would characterize our present state as one of non-participation, in the sense that we have a distance towards everything. And his whole work was, in a sense, aimed at trying to describe how we, through especially an intensification of our imagination, can achieve a renewal of participation, which is another way of speaking about the affordances of material and practical building. And I would even go as far as saying that, in a sense, you could view Waldorf education as an attempt to invite our children and youth to develop a capacity for participation. Uh, and this, I think, also warrants a word about morality, because it would be kind of romanticizing to think that participation is very good and non-participation is a very bad thing that generally leads to illnesses and evil. I would say that none of these are in their own on their own good or bad in a moral sense. You can have a massive degree of participation or imagination. Just view any kind of artist's biography and be very tempted to use that capacity for imagination in order to exert power over other people, or uh, engage in other acts that at least could be considered immoral. So, and the same holds true if we talk about crafts or working with matter, in the sense that there's also people who work with crafts who design atomic bombs and weapons and things like that. So, not all craftspeople have used their capacity uh, for something that is constructive or enriching to other people, depending on, of course, and that's a huge discussion that I'm not going to go into here, how we judge these things. But I think it's important to consider also that morality as such is something that we are always left having to strive for, regardless of the kind of context that we are working in. So the context in itself won't save us from this. So, and I'm saying this explicitly because I'm going to tell a bunch of stories also that are very nice in a bunch of different ways, that have a moral core to some degree, but that don't really problematize that issue. Now, I think I want to take my direct point of departure with the German romantic poet Novalis, who in one of his fragments wrote, Wir sind auf einer Mission, zur Bildung der Erde sind wir berufen, which would translate something like, we are on a mission, we are called to the building of the earth. And I think that's one of the grand things to think about when we think about what we are doing when we're working with the earth, in the sense of when we're working with crafts, or when we're working in the garden, or when we're working on a farm. I would kind of include all of these things in this context. And having said that, I think it's worth going over to say something a bit about some different perspectives on material building. So, as I also mentioned, we can talk about material building in connection with practical building, in the sense that I've been or learned bookbinding, and of course, part of learning a practic or a craft is you also learn how to uh, communicate and interact with a bunch of materials. As a bookbinder, it's an immensely rich field of matter that becomes familiar to you. Not just paper, but a number of different fibers, different glues, different pigments, different kinds of gold, different kinds of paste, and so on and so on. There's a lot of chemistry going on in bookbinding. And that connection is in itself really interesting to explore. There's also something directly related to matter or substance, both living and inert. I think the artwork by Wolfgang Leib is a very beautiful example of that. Uh, there's also something to be said about the environment as a building affordance, the way a workshop or a laboratory affords something, or what would be another word? Yeah, afford is the word I would use in English. Afford something to the students that is not the same as a regular classroom, for instance. And speaking as a bookbinding teacher, I would say, because I've also taught other subjects in regular classrooms, that being in the workshop is like being enveloped by a much more powerful teacher than the one I am. So in a sense, the workshop does a much more intense pedagogical work than I do on my own, because it offers up so much that is on its way to becoming something that is not sensible, sensory, or can be touched and smelled and tasted to some degree at least, and so on. And there are so many things surrounding me in the workshop that I can immediately grasp and show or introduce or indicate with the students, that it drastically enriches what has been possible for me to do educationally. Um, and there's also a perspective which I will come back to almost immediately regarding the knowledge potential of substances and work processes, in the sense that you can learn how to, what can we say? You can learn how to make candles, but hidden in that almost simple activity of dipping the wick into molten wax is also a huge potential of both scientific or natural scientific knowledge of culture and so on, that can be explored almost as much as we would just like to do. And I know I saw, I think Mr. Dirk Rode was sitting in the audience. I don't know if he's still sitting there, but I know he has worked a little bit about that. I'll be
Yes,
getting
I do.
yes. So with the Chemical History of a Candle by Michael Faraday, this beautiful series of lectures that Faraday held in the 19th century, which you can, which really illustrates the potential that I'm talking about here, which I'll be getting back to soon. And I think to refer to the pictures that you're seeing, what does it mean for the trees themselves to become chairs? That is, what is this, the building of the earth that we're talking about? What you're seeing on the top is the new chairs. They're not new anymore. They were new a couple of years back for the bookbindery at the Christopher School where I work. We had to renew our chairs. The old ones were breaking down. And I had the idea that it would be a wonderful thing if you could have the chairs in the 7 different planetary woods. So there are, I think we made 28 chairs, 4 in each kind of wood. So there's, let me see if there's beech wood and birch and oak and cherry and I didn't take the time to translate all these into English from Swedish. So elm and a couple more that I forgot at the moment. And I would have loved to have done this fully at the school with the students. That turned out to be a bit of a too much of a task. I couldn't really engage enough colleagues in that work to get it done. But at least, as you see on the bottom page, we got the chairs without them being fully finished, so we could do the final sanding and the oiling of them. And so I could invite the students to participate in the actual making of the furnishing. And of course, the chairs now are a silent pedagogical question every time the students enter the workshop. Why do they look different? Why are their colors different? Why is one very heavy and why is one very light when you're carrying it? And so on. There's so many things not immediately connected to the almost perhaps extreme anthroposophical element of why choose these 7 woods and so on, but just in the sense that you're touching something and you're experiencing the differences between. And I think that's one of the important things here, is that if you make the chairs out of one single kind of wood, the students get nothing to compare with. And I think that's one of the most intense elements of didactics in almost every area, is that we need to work with contrasts or comparisons, or however you want to phrase it. And that brings me to the first example, I believe. yes. The kind of understanding that material building affordances carry as a potential, and where I think that we have so much more that we could do in our schools. And I think it's a matter of uh, fairly intense work to unpack, as I wrote here, the knowledge potential of substances and vocational tasks. As I mentioned, uh, Rhoda wrote a dissertation on this within the field of Lehrkunstdidaktik, which I think is one of the areas, didactical schools, where they've gone the furthest in trying to develop this kind of uh, uh, idea, although not necessarily directly connected to materials and crafts, but perhaps more generally in connection to a regular humanist gymnasium. And I will explain a little bit more what I mean with reference to this picture. So you have three books here. You have to the left a interim binding, I would call it. It's a very odd craft object in the sense that it contains almost the entire development of the codex form of the book from 1800 years ago or whenever it began to be developed. It's unclear historically, as far as I know, until the most modern contemporary functionalism. I've tried to find other craft objects that synthesize the whole development of the craft object in one and the same. I haven't really been able to do that. I can't say that I've looked very systematically, but I think it's so interesting. If you look at the book, I'm going to hold the, let me see, here we go. You can see here too, can you see the stitching on the back? So the stitching is a cross stitching. That stitching is a simplified Coptic Bible binding. It comes with a very funny story, or at least I think it's funny that my bookbinding master used to tell all the students all the time. I have no idea if it's actually true because I've never been able to find any sourcing for it except him. But he says that the Coptic monks, I assume in Egypt and in that part of the world, in the 7th and 8th centuries, would bind their Bibles like that, but even more thickly together, because apparently they were only allowed to use the word of God in their self-defense. And when they were out on the roads, they were often attacked um, by bandits. And so they were literally using their Bibles as weapons because they were so heavy and so sturdy that when they put some weights in one end of it, they worked pretty much as a good club. And that's one of the reasons why the original Coptic Bibles were bound like that, according again to my bookbinding master. But it's also a technique that takes us back in about 1500 years ago in the development of the book. The paper we use is a paper almost a replica of how the paper was looked in Europe when paper making came to Europe in the 14th century. So you have a fairly thick, wonderful paper made by a German paper mill called Hanemühle. That is, if you ever have a chance to touch paper like this, it's like a sunrise that goes into your fingertips. And that gives the students or us a reason to speak about the whole medieval situation when paper first came to Europe before or uh, about 100 years, not even that, 50 years, no, 100 years before Gutenberg made his printing press. And before that, we have what is actually made as the book is stitched on parchment. And anyone with a bit of imagination can consider how many hides of calves or sheep are needed to make one Bible. It's literally in the hundreds. And so if Gutenberg had made his printing press 150 years earlier, there would have just been no need to print books because there would have been no material to actually uh, 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 print on in enough number of copies for the printing press to make much sense. And so there's so much to talk about. Of course, I can't really talk about all of it here. I'm just trying to give an example to talk about within this single object regarding European cultural history and cultural history generally. You can, of course, expand it if you want to, for instance, to Korea, where the first book in movable type was printed, I think 70 years before Gutenberg printed his Bibles. And you can go on and on. The important thing is there's something in these objects and in these materials that we can really explore, and that up until now, as far as I know, has only been partially explored, a little bit here, a little bit there. This systematic work in building up what in Lehrkunstdidaktik is called a Lehrstück, or a kind of piece where you go as far as write down the whole uh, drama of how to unfold or unpack this from this single or multiple objects. It's even more interesting and more direct with the next two books, because in the middle you have a Japanese book, and to the right you have a fairly common uh, European style book. And it's absolutely beautiful how these two books, in every single detail, are their exact opposites. So you go from the hard covers of the European book. Originally, European books generally had wooden covers, and you have these very soft covers of Japanese books. Unfortunately, I misplaced mine, so I can't actually hold it up and demonstrate it directly. You have the differences in formats because, of course, we write horizontally and they write vertically. You have the folding of the papers I can actually show on the Korean style. The papers are folded in what we would call, I say we because I'm sitting here in Sweden, uh, the front of the book, whereas they're open in what we would call the back of the book, reversely from what I'm used to. Normally, you would print the title of the book here in, again, what would be the front rather than here in the back. And of course, then if you go on to the writing tools, we're used to writing with feather pens, hard pens with ink made of generally or originally often plant juices. So the ink was generally transparent on very thick paper that was opaque. Uh, and in East Asia, you have the complete opposite. You write with brushes that are soft. You write with ink based on ashes, so it's opaque, and you have so thin paper that it's almost completely transparent. Bible paper, as a comparison, is about 40 grams per square meter. That's the measure of a paper's thickness. Copying paper is usually 80 or 90 grams. A regular Japanese or Chinese paper is often around 15 grams, 10 grams. You can go down even to 5, uh, owing to the different fibers used in making these papers. And so that would be beginning to kind of trying to exemplify what the potential is in these uh, uh, affordances of building that materials hold. I'm not actually going to speak much about this sequence of images. This is something I made together with a couple of students in the bookbindery at the Christopher School. So again, here we tried to combine uh, what is really a fairly advanced conceptualization of geometry uh, in actually crafting something that visualizes it, and then also trying to make it as beautiful as we could. So I've used together with them paper from, I believe, the Philippines, with the silver inlays and the blue and gold inlays in the red. Uh, if we didn't get, and I never managed to solve how to gild the star with gold leaf. So that's still something I have to get around to. Um, to get back to this wonderful sequence of lectures by Michael Faraday, you can find his lectures on the chemical history of a candle online. There's even a sequence of demonstrations of how Faraday arranged his experiments on YouTube, if it hasn't disappeared. I think is also so interesting what just the substance of wax causes for questions when you want to do this. So we decided together with our teacher students, we do this, I think, with almost all our teacher students at the Waldorf University College nowadays. My colleague, who is a physics and chemistry teacher, uh, demonstrates some of Faraday's experiments for them. And then we also do the actual candle making. And it's not as simple as just getting some stuff and then doing the candle making. And let me tell you, when we wanted to do it, it took me uh, a number of days to figure out a recipe for it that was not a risk to the student's health and that was also acceptable from a moral perspective. And that comes from, on the one hand, almost all candles made with this technique. I'm not entirely sure what it's called in English. In Swedish, it's called stöparljus. Uh, in any case, you can see on the picture what they're doing. Uh, you have stearic wax is the main wax kind, but then to get the candle to be really smooth, you can't really just do it with stearic wax. Pure stearic wax candles aren't made with this technique. You usually introduce about 10% or 15% paraffin wax. And anyone who reads up a little bit about paraffin wax knows that it's a synthetic wax coming from oil residues. And it's very unhealthy to burn candles made with paraffin wax inside or indoors. And of course, working at a school, it would be completely irresponsible to do this both with kids and with teacher students. So we had to figure out how to make these candles without paraffin wax. And the other problem was that when you buy stearic wax, you pretty quickly get to know that there are two different kinds. There's uh, one kind coming from the animal kingdom, made from what's slaktrester, leftovers from butcheries, and there's one kind from the plant kingdom. And I assume most of us probably say, well, that's great. We'll take the plant kingdom one. Uh, and then you realize that almost all stearic wax made from plants is made from palm wax. Uh, so it's not self-evident that that's a better choice. And there you are brought back, and this is a good example of it, but I think you can find it if you look almost everywhere. You're brought back to the moral issue, in that as soon as we work with the earth, we're always confronted with questions of our morality in relation to this. What are we actually doing to the earth when we transform it? What are we doing to the trees when we take the freedom? No, that's a Swedish phrase, but uh, meaning that we decide that we have the right to cut them down and turn them into the chairs that we need to sit on in the workshop. It's by far not a question that is devoid of morality, and it's almost impossible to follow these things through to the very end. Because of course I have no idea how the stearic wax that I actually ended up buying was produced. Uh, I would have to go to the factories, I assume, to actually look at that in order to follow up on it. And to get back to the recipe, I finally found a recipe that uh, suggested 30% beeswax instead of the paraffin, which of course causes the candles to be extremely expensive compared to if you use paraffin. But I think from my perspective, uh, that was defensible. And of course, then you can always discuss, is this the best way to use the beeswax that we have? And and there's a bunch of other questions that, of course, suggest themselves. But we thought it would be a wonderful addition to Faraday's sequence of experiments if the students in schools in the lower grades, in grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, had made candles, and different candles, and had been taught by their teachers to pay attention to the way the wicks bend when the candle burns and things like that, which you can really do with young kids too. And then when they come up to seventh and eighth grade, they'll have a different inner relationship towards the demonstrations that a teacher would then be able to make uh, in more close uh, inspiration from Faraday. There are some other examples that I'm just going to mention. One is this very interesting presentation by a Swiss sculptor, Christian Bremer, who has worked with sculpting the development of the embryo. Uh, there's, and here I'm looking directly at you, Christoph. There's a book I got actually from Christoph Wiechert many years ago. It's almost 20 years ago by Fitzjulius called, in English, the translation would be Alchemical Path, where Fitzjulius develops these, I would almost call them vignettes of from different perspectives of what happens if you're making bricks, what happens if you're making it's a white paint made from lead that you let rot under a compost, and so on and so on, and really explores the different processes uh, that you can see that go on if you look beyond the surface uh, into this work. And so I made sure to mention this because I know for a fact that there's a lot of this kind of stuff that happens at individual schools where different teachers or collections of teachers work together to develop it. It's just that we, to my knowledge, lack any kind of systematic effort to document it and to place it in a wider didactical framework. It's perhaps what I would like to say. Uh, The same can be said with regards to colors and pigments. As you've seen on some of the previous pictures, I work a lot with marbling together with my students, uh, which is this kind of work that you see here, where you drip colors onto a surface of it's carrageen moss um, decooked. I don't know my English technical terms here, unfortunately, but it's kind of it has the same feel as a thick cream. Otherwise, pure water can't carry watercolor, and then you have to coat paper with what's it called in English? Kind of salt. Alunsalt is the Swedish word for it, which causes the color to actually adhese, adhe adhesive is a word in English, uh, to stick to the paper. And then you get these beautiful patterns that I'm sure you're all familiar with from older books. And this is a student right in the middle of working with one. This is another finished pattern just before or I think it's actually on the paper. Um, so we made our watercolors from scratch. So together with the students, I buy the different pigments, the ochres or earth pigments and the plant pigments, and of course some synthetic pigments because we can't afford to buy some of the natural pigments uh, like for instance this red that we have here. It's called krapprött in Swedish. Uh, it's immensely expensive. It's a beautiful plant pigment made from roots of a plant. So you see the roots, someone's holding them in their hand. They're that intensely red. And then you, of course, have to dry it. You have to grind it. And then you have to explore what kind of binders you're going to use to get the pigments to stick together. Gum arabic is very common, but you also use a lot of other saps and honey and molasses and so on. And then you have to use solvents. And then, of course, the work of making the pigment uh, and making the color and you have these balls of agate that you put into a cylinder, and then you turn the pigment together with the water and the solvent, usually alcohol, and the binders for at least a couple of days or so to get the pigments to really disperse and get coated with the binders. Um, so again, here we have this beautiful potential to grow the plant pigments or to go out and dig for the earth pigments, and then to go through the entire process until the students have the paints that they're actually going to use. And if you do this, then of course you develop a completely different relationship to what we are working with as people when we work with the colors, when we work with the brushes and so on. And I understand we can't do this everywhere all the time, but we can definitely think through when we can do it and when it's the most holds the greatest potential to really enrich our students' understanding and capacity for participation, to return to that term, in the world. And that's also why I think participation is such an interesting issue, because it's not something that's just a matter of, yeah, let's get really imaginative, but participation is about skill, about practice, about so many things that are related to the world and all its uh, magnificent plurality. And so the students really, through the senses, need to get to know that kind of richness if the participation is to go beyond a kind of social participation and an intellectual participation. Uh, Now, I would get to the other part of this. So I've talked a bit about the kind of intellectual building affordances of materials and substances and tools, um, or the way they can enrich our understanding and our structuring of how we teach. And I think all of those things could very profitably be uh, explored in colloquia, because one of the main issues is, of course, that a lot of us who are craft teachers, we don't have the full breadth of knowledge that a history teacher has or a chemistry teacher has, and so on. So it's difficult for us on our part to fully see where the activities that we're engaged in directly connect with something that the chemistry teacher, for example, has to teach his or her students. Because, of course, it's not a matter of just introducing any kind of craft or any kind of substance, but you have to think through, if you want to do it in the way we're talking about here, where these connections are to teaching technology or teaching whatever the other subjects may be. And for that, we need the other subject teachers to interact with us. And it's, of course, a reciprocal issue. It's difficult for the subject teachers to know much about the different crafts. Even a very knowledgeable subject teacher, or even a crafts person like myself, I don't know very much about pottery or metalwork and so on. That I know enough about it to know that I know too little to really have the full uh, depth of those crafts at my fingertips. So to really explore this, we would have to do it collectively, I would say. It's a rare thing when a teacher can do these things on his or her own. And I think that's one of the most valuable elements of having a special Waldorf teacher educational institutions. I think it's the teacher training institutions that have the greatest potential to actually carry that kind of developmental work, because it's very time consuming, as I can attest to. I could tell you a story about when we wanted to cast bronze arrowheads with some of our teacher students too, so that they could experience what it is to have an arrowhead in bronze and to make one in iron, and what the actual material difference is to some degree between what we call the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And that almost brought me to a standstill. It was so much work to develop uh, the practical elements of it. But there's a different or second aspect that I've come across in my work as a teacher regarding material building that I would call a healing aspect. And this part I can really only talk about in narrative form, I think, but I find it extremely important that there's a lot of potential in practical work, in working with matter, and again, I'm saying matter now, including living matter, which might be almost offensive, but to speak of in that sense. But I've experienced it or know from other people who have told me about it uh, in a few different ways, and I've tried to kind of give it a description here. So I would say one way of talking about it is in the sense of uh, a kind of liberation. And I've, as you can see from the picture here, worked a lot with gold leaf in my days. As a bookbinder, you do edge gilding on books. You know, when you put gold on the edges of books. As you can see, I have no capacity to work with left and right, which is an embarrassment in itself for me as a bookbinder. But I did my bookbinding training as a form of therapy. In any case, the edge gilding is part of learning the craft. So I was introduced to gold leaf at the age of 18 or 19. And um, you can work with a lot of different gilding techniques just within the realm of bookbinding. And I came to be interested more in that. So as you can see here, we've gilded an ostrich egg. Ida Obermann, who I saw in the audience, uh, has a personal experience of doing this when we were invited to the Community School for Creative Education in Oakland and did it with the students there. So I gilded some ostrich eggs with the sixth, seventh, and eighth graders. And that's part of a kind of a project I have to liberate gold from the incredible immorality that we've forced it into. I remember my bookbinding teacher Wolfgang was telling me that any gold coin that you hold in your hand that's more than a few years old usually has one or two murders connected to it over its lifetime. And so I would say that gold as a substance is, on the one hand, as in all the fairy tales, almost I think from every culture that I've heard of thus far, connected to the sun and to wisdom. And at the same time, it's the substance that, at least in Europe, has caused the most greed of almost anything you can imagine. And through that greed, destruction in a way that is almost unfathomable. And I would say that the gold that we have in our hands is in need of a kind of healing, of a liberation, of what Novalis talks about when he talks about the building of the earth. And the beautiful thing with gold leaf is that it's almost impossible to recuperate. It's so thin that it disappears in the skin if we put it onto our on the palms of our hands. And so when we work with gold leaf, what we're actually doing is I would say, dispersing or spiritualizing the gold. We're making it so thin that it's almost not material anymore. It's also the substance that can be made the thinnest of all common substances uh, that I know of. I think perhaps iridium or some of the more uncommon metals can be made even thinner, but gold is so thin that it's transparent when it's made the thinnest. And so basically, my intention is that we can sooner or later remake all gold into gold leaf and gild the whole world. It's not actually going to cover the whole world, but a substantial part. And then it's just going to dissolve into the cosmos. And that's where we've provided kind of a gift that humanity can give to the gold after having taken so much. And of course, this is a nice story. But the other part of it is that uh, in this story, it was also used in, I guess you could say, almost the reverse. I had a student, this was in 12th grade. Or this was a group of students. We were sitting, it was just at the beginning of 12th grade, so I didn't know them very, very well. And we were folding papers for books. And I was, as I commonly do, talking to them about how important it is when you fold the papers to really use your fingertips and to feel the paper and try to go into that experience uh, and feel what the structure is and so on. And there was one of the students who looked increasingly angry and irritated. And I can't remember exactly. I think I turned to her uh, and asked her if what was the matter, and she said, "Do you really want to know?" And I had a kind of bad feeling at that point. Uh, and I'm not sure if I even said yes, but then she told me that she had no feeling in her fingertips. And she explained that when she had been in eighth grade, she came to our school, I think in 10th grade or maybe in ninth grade. Um, she had been, what's more but in English? Uh, she had been bullied by her classmates to a degree where they had pressed her palms to a very hot heater, and she had got such severe burns that her nerves had become damaged. And I think she was slowly regaining the feeling in her palms, but it was definitely not there entirely by that point. And I remember I was sitting there, uh, very struck and of course very sad for her, and I couldn't immediately think what to say. And I was rescued by a fellow student of hers that was because she hadn't told anyone in her class either, it turned out, who said something uh, participatory to her, and then we just continued working, and I had about a half an hour to kind of think of what I wanted to do. And close towards the end of the lesson, I I had the idea that I could talk to her and offer her the opportunity to uh, kind of how would you say that in English? Kind of mm, heal or liberate herself from that pain with the help of gold. And so we had a small ritual. We didn't speak about it that much. I didn't say much about what I thought it meant. She didn't say much except that she did it. And so at the end of almost every lesson throughout the fall, she got a couple of small pieces of gold leaf and massaged them into her palms of her hands. And that was that. And it took a bit of courage to even initiate that process because I was afraid she would think I was completely nuts. It's also not easy to speak about because I still feel like it could sound like I'm completely nuts, but um, and it took a couple of years after she left school before I had the chance to get in touch with her, and I asked her how she experienced it because I wanted some time to go before I disturbed the process in itself with a reflective action. And she explained that it had meant a lot to her, especially for her at that point, perhaps that I didn't try to analyze things. I didn't ask her so many things. She was so tired of all the psychologists and everyone who wanted to talk about it. And so for her, perhaps, at least on a conscious level, it was most valuable to just be able to do something instead of talk. And that's been my experience in different uh, respects with regards to practical work, is that we've had students at the Christopher School who have come to the workshops to just be with us for extended periods of time because they've had all kinds of difficulties. And a lot of them, no, I'm exaggerating, but several of them, in my personal experience, uh, have have begun talking almost as soon as the environment wasn't expecting them to talk, if I could say it that way. And I'll come back to that in a second. Um, and I'm gonna have to skip one of the stories here, but I'm going to tell the story about the connection bit too, because I think it's very poignant in many ways. This one was told to me by a farmer at Ruskin Mill, which is an absolutely amazing institution in England, founded by Angus Gordon. I've been there a few times to explore the way they've been working, and of course, they work with youth who have more severe difficulties of different kinds. And Bernie told a story about a young man. He was, I think, 14 or 15. He said, who, when he came, had immense difficulties to form any kind of connection with anyone. He wasn't really grounded, so he was still walking on his toes, and his gaze was slightly above the horizon. So he was always looking a bit upwards and never directly into something. And he did as they do with at Ruskin Mill. They have a curriculum where the students move through the different workshops and then to the farm. And Bernie, who was working at the farm, he took care of the students and they did a bunch of different things. They also had a hen house with hens and chickens. And together with the hens and chickens, Bernie had three ducks. And these ducks were actually the pets of him and his family. So they didn't really belong to the farm. And he said it was strange because every time the man or boy was up at the farm, he would try to slip his, not guardian, his companion, and they would find him when they finally did, always at the hen house, always kind of looking or staring at the hens. And Bernie said that every time he was a bit worried because you can see that the stare wasn't really friendly. It had a kind of malevolence to it that worried him a bit. And every time that they found him, he was a bit closer to the house until finally they found him with his whole body inside the hen house and only his head sticking out. Uh, and then this must have been in like November or so. Uh, one morning, his companion and the young man came and they were carrying a dead duck. And Bernie wasn't really surprised that it had gone this far, and the duck had clearly been strangled. And so he sat himself down together with the young man, and he didn't want to go into like a tirade or a big moralizing about what had been going on. Instead, he tried to uh, talk in a fairly neutral tone, saying, "Well, this is very unfortunate, and it's strange. It can't be the fox, can it? It has no bite marks, and it can't be a badger, I think was the other example he had of some animal that could have actually harmed the duck." And and they talked a little bit like that until suddenly the young man started to say things like, "Yeah, I didn't kill the duck. And I also didn't uh, kill our pet dog. And I also didn't hurt my sister." And then this whole litany of things that obviously were things he had done, and that he was confessing to, but in a reverse way, came out. And Bernie said to me, I remember that they wanted him to have some kind of consequence uh, in an immediate term, but what they really felt was that what he needed practice in was empathy. And the best thing he had to offer in that respect, and here I would be at a loss as a bookbinder, I could never offer this in this direct way from my workshop. But the best thing he could do was to invite the young man back to the farm in the spring when the ewes had gotten their lambs, because there's always either a ewe who dies or who has one lamb too many. So there's a couple of lambs that always need to be fed with a bottle. And he said, holding a little newborn lamb in your arms and feeding it is perhaps the most empathy generating activity that you can conceive of. And so he said, it's probably best for you if we spend a little time apart now, but I would like to invite you back in the springtime. And he did. And they did everything they could to make the environment as safe as they could for the young man. And then he spent, what was it, 10 weeks or so feeding the lambs. And this activity had a profound transformative effect on on the on this man. And afterwards, he began to be able to have friends. He slowly began walking with his feet on the ground and his gaze straight forwards and so on. It deeply changed who he could be, I think I would choose to say. And again, I'm trying to talk about these examples because I think if we had a systematic activity of working with this, if we systematically gathered what we already know and then tried to explore what we could know even further, then I think even and also in this respect, we know very little at the moment of the healing potential of um, of the earth, if I can use that term to cover everything that has to do with uh, matter, substances, tools, craft work, and working in the garden and with animals and so on. And we know some stuff already. Um, I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to briefly mention this too. This is a book bound by a girl in ninth grade at the Christopher School. She came to the bookbindery uh, a few days straight from the hospital, I think, even a few days after she had tried to take her whole own life. She still had her bandages on her arms. And I made this together with her uh, because she was listening to a conversation I had with a 12th grader where I tried to explain how important it was to think about the colors you choose when making a book. And she asked me what I meant. And I said, it's difficult for me to really explain, but I'll be happy to make a book with you and you can experience it. And she said yes to that. And I think we spent about 6 months making this, not every day, all day, but uh, several times a week, a few hours. And during that time, we spent most of our energy working on the book, of course. She started to speak about her experiences, and uh, mainly, I got to know her well enough that when she continued in 10th grade, she would spend a lot of time in the bookbindery and confide in me. And I would have to send her to a psychologist a bunch of times because there were things that she told me that I couldn't actually deal with. But what she said when I talked to her about this process a few years after she had left school, I still uh, have some contact with her, is that it gave her a kind of fundamental faith in the fact that life was meaningful and that it's even a point to try to uh, do something with it. So, what I'm trying to say is that there's a kind of uh, moral building affordance inherent in this combination of practical work and doing something that is we did a whole leather binding, as you can see. I tried to make it as beautiful as I can conceive of. You don't see the gold leaf on the edge gilding, but we did everything that I knew or have in my power as a bookbinder to make something really what's practful in English, uh, powerful in in its impact in the way it speaks to the student who's made it, and that affordance of moral building, I would say, is not in the sense that you develop a specific moral judgment, but in the sense that every moral judgment is grounded in this faith that life is meaningful to begin with. If you have no faith in the meaning of life, then there's no point in making a moral judgment in any case. So that's also an area or a field of healing, I think, where there's a reciprocity between what the earth gives to us and what we can give back to the earth by using its materials in this way. Uh, and with that, I'm at my last picture. Uh, and I think what I've been talking about here, and I'm sure this hasn't really uh, passed many of you by, is in different ways about transformations. And there's a wonderful story that, again, my absolutely fabulous and amazing bookbinding teacher Wolfgang told me several times in different contexts, um, which pretty much goes like this. Um, it's about the medieval philosopher Nicholas of Cus or Cusanus, um, who who was a Roman cardinal as well. And on one occasion, he was traveling or visiting Rome, and he had a good friend who was a bishop. And this bishop came to him and said, "Look, you have to come to my place. I have the most or the wisest philosopher uh, I've ever met, who I want to introduce you to. He's not a learned man, he's illiterate, a layman, but the things he says." are not to be believed, and unless you hear them yourself. And so he takes Cusanus with him back to his house, and then he's a bit embarrassed because he can't find this layman anywhere. And they look all around the house, and finally, uh, after much ado, they find him in the stairs down to the cellar. And he's sitting there in the stairwell, and he's carving a wooden spoon. And this embarrasses the bishop even more. And he says something to the effect that, uh, how can you, with your wisdom and philosophical skill, do something so simplistic as making a wooden spoon? Shouldn't you just leave that for the farmers or the servants? And the layman replies, uh, probably something in between, but the main reply is, I'm working formatively on Die ganze Löffelheit is difficult to translate from German. The whole spooniness would be the literal translation of the earth. So what he is saying is, in effect, that by making this spoon, he is also at the same time shaping everything in the earth that has spoonness. I wouldn't even go so far as to say the quality of a spoon, but Löffelheit is a real substantial thing, I would say. Uh, Not as a kind of analogy or allegory, but in effect, he's actually talking about uh, a process that, or a transformation that he is engaged in. Uh, Interestingly, there is a book by Cusanus himself called Idiota de Mente, The Layman on the Spirit would be the translation, that has this story, but in a different form. And where Cusanus has the layman talking about the spoonness as a kind of analogy to the Platonic ideas. And so this, I think the version I heard from Wolfgang is a kind of craftsman's pun on Cusanus, because the craftspeople that probably read Cusanus' original text felt that Cusanus had misunderstood the layman and what he actually meant to say, which I find really funny and hugely interesting, really. And so I think that's to get back to what Novalis said about the building of the earth, is if we work with that kind of consciousness in relation to even the simplest of our uh, material tasks, we can contemplate what kind of ness or height are we actually engaged in? What is the bookness of the earth? When I do the bookbinding work, it's been a mystery to me for 20 years or so. Uh, and what does it mean that we develop an awareness of this? And I think this is part of what Waldorf schools have the potential to be hosts of, I think I would say. That Waldorf schools have the potential to invite. I think in a sense, what I'm talking about here, which is also illustrated by this picture, is a tradition that is much older, uh, but that is in a sense always there as a kind of potential gift to Waldorf education. If Waldorf schools or if Waldorf teachers are interested in inviting this gift over and over and over again. And I would say the 20th century has seen some incredibly beautiful ways of making this invitation. If you walk through Waldorf schools and see what has been done, and if you go into classrooms and see when these things are taken up. But I think as of yet, it's like more of a hello and a handshake rather than an embrace and a full collaboration. And so that would be perhaps a good way to end this lecture, which I think has taken about almost 15 minutes longer than I intended it to. And so we have a little bit of space at least for questions or a dialogue if there's anyone who wishes to throw some imaginary potatoes at their computer screen. Uh, that's also perfectly fine at this point. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you so much, Rui. That was, you're not only a good craftsman, but also a good storyteller, I think. That was really wonderful to listen to you. And I admire your way of giving have some kind of a metaphorical view on the things you put. So everything you present, there is, so to speak, a double layer or a triple layer or whatever. And it's very much inspiring to listen. Thank you so much for that lecture.
Yeah.
As soon as I try to do this kind of more discursive talk, uh, it's not quite as enthusiastically received. But I think
Mm.
it would be different if, for instance, I did the bookbinding with them first, or the marbling or the gilding, and then the chemistry teacher or the history teacher, or of course, for my part, I could teach some of the cultural history at least without completely embarrassing myself. Uh, that could be done either as a main lesson,
Mm.
or
Mm.
you
Mm.
could rethink the main lesson format so that the main
Yeah.
lessons stretch over larger blocks of time during the
Yeah.
day. So you can
Yeah.
do more of a combination, but then you have to get the students used to understanding that they're
Yeah.
doing several different things at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what you said about the different types of substance you can
Mm,
use for candle making.
mm.
You developed that with the children, with the
Oh, yeah,
students
yeah,
together. Yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
That
yeah,
I've talked to the students with when I've done candle making with
yeah.
students. Perhaps I wouldn't say all of that to a third grader, but if
No,
we're up
no,
in sixth grade,
yeah.
definitely.
And they are and they go with you then.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That I
yeah.
would say. And I mean, this is perhaps one of the best examples where Bremer really explains how he does the sculpting and how the biology teacher teaches biology and how they bring these two things together in one and the same main lesson, period.
Mm, mm,
So
mm.
there's a even better example of how this cooperation or collaboration has already been done.
Yeah, but what you told about that girl and you make that book with
Mm,
her,
mm.
that goes over weeks, that
Oh, yeah.
process.
Yeah, but of course, that's part of what would you call it? Supportive education in the sense
Yeah,
that
yeah.
she's completely outside of regular
Mm, okay.
lessons. That's why I didn't include it directly in this kind of understanding
Yeah.
oriented part,
Mm,
but much more in the healing part,
yeah,
in the sense
yeah,
that
yeah.
uh, we have students in the workshops sometimes
Mm,
days at end or
mm,
months at end
mm,
because
mm,
they can't handle being in
mm,
school.
mm.
It's just we're just happy that they're not at home,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
and something
yeah,
happens in that
yeah,
process,
yeah,
at least for a lot of them, if not all of them.
yeah. It sounds as a wonderful service to the earth,
Mm,
his work. Yeah, thank you
mm,
so much. Yeah,
mm.
quite
Yeah,
impressive. Thank you.
yeah. I think that's what we have as a potential is understanding that service to the earth is
Mm,
not just about eating organic.
yeah,
It's not, it's a much deeper thing that
mm,
has to do with education.
yeah,
And I think Novalis was something, uh, found something when he said that, that has,
mm,
it's just
mm,
a seed, but if you open it, it has
yeah,
this immense vistas of
tip,
perspective.
tip. Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you so much, and I wish you a good night, a good day wherever you are, and a good week till next Tuesday.